where people were saying, are we on the verge of a world war? Are we entering a world war? And the idea of a world war is, I think, as most people have in their minds, is something similar to, of course, the previous World War, World War II, of the major powers of the world directly fighting each other, sustained combat across continents, or even at the other extreme, or I guess at the not other extreme, but at the extreme would be, of course, full out nuclear conflict, which is the use of nuclear weapons, Armageddon, kind of these ideas, I think, is what people have in mind when they use the phrase World War. We're not in that situation. Fortunately, we're not in that situation. But that doesn't mean that we're in a good situation. And so what we are is we're not in a situation of a single world war like a World War II, where it is some sort of unified conflict with two sides and they're fighting each other across the globe. But instead, we're in a situation where there are a number of conflicts, and by number, meaning a record number of conflicts happening around the world at the same time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Through Conversations podcast, where I'm joined by Professor Paul Poast. He's a friend of the show. He's been a guest previously, and I hope to have him many times more in the future. So, Professor, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, absolutely my pleasure, Alex.
I'm glad to have you because, you know, it's a double-edged sword, that statement, because the world is on fire, but there's no one else to explain us better why is the world on fire and what could happen, and, you know, your insights into the whole world. And recently you just wrote an article which is not a world war, but a world at war, which was very eye-opening and insightful, and it does shed a light on what's happening throughout the world with, you know, many global wars, you could argue, but in Ukraine, we also have the war in Gaza. We have other conflicts cascading across the world. So I'd love for our listeners to have an insight into this article and your insights into why is the world not having a world war, but rather the world is at war.
Absolutely. And this is something that unfortunately is a theme of 2023. And so hence that piece, as you referenced, was published in November 2023. And unfortunately, it could probably also be a theme of 2024. Of course, there's other themes we could talk about 2024. But the main idea is that this is not something that is, in my view, a one-off. This is something that we need to be prepared for, thinking about for quite a while. And so the idea that we're not in a world war, but a world at war is the following. So world war was a phrase that was used quite a bit at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, or at least the Russian full invasion of Ukraine, to be more accurate, back in February of 2022, where people were saying, are we on the verge of a world war? Are we entering a world war? And the idea of a world war is, I think, as most people have in their minds, is something similar to, of course, the previous World War, World War II, of the major powers of the world directly fighting each other, sustained combat across continents, or even at the other extreme, or I guess at the not other extreme, but at the extreme would be, of course, full out nuclear conflict, which is the use of nuclear weapons, Armageddon, kind of these ideas, I think, is what people have in mind when they use the phrase World War. And as I'm arguing in this piece, and I've brought this up in some other contexts as well, is we're not in that situation. Fortunately, we're not in that situation. But that doesn't mean that we're in a good situation. And so what we are is we're not in a situation of a single world war like a World War II, where it is some sort of unified conflict with two sides and they're fighting each other across the globe. But instead, we're in a situation where there are a number of conflicts, and by number, meaning a record number of conflicts happening around the world at the same time. And that's what I mean by the fact that we're in a world at war, as opposed to a single global war. Now, a lot of these wars are connected. Not all of them are connected. And even when the wars aren't connected, and of course, this is something we can absolutely talk about, there could be some common causes to these wars, even if the one war is not connected to the other. But that's what we mean by it being a world at war. And part of the basis for this was a quantitative basis. How do I come up with that number? And what I point to is data coming from the Uppsala Conflict Data Project, and that is out of Uppsala University in Sweden. This is a long-standing project where they code the prevalence and presence of armed conflict around the world, and they've been doing this project since the 1980s, but they have this data going back into the 1940s and really a little bit earlier, but the main part of the data is after 1945, after World War II. And according to those data, 2023 witnessed the most armed conflicts in the world since 1945. So basically since the end of World War II, let alone the end of the Cold War, which of course the end of the Cold War, thinking about 1990, 91, people saying, oh, this is the quote end of history, new age, unipolar moment, everything. But 2023 actually saw the most conflict in the world since the end of World War II. And so that puts in perspective what we mean by 2023 being this year of conflict, and specifically being that we're in a world at war as opposed to a world war.
Wow, I didn't know that fact that, it's been the highest level of wars in the since the catastrophic events of World War II. That's mind-boggling. And Professor, my question here is, you also touch on how one of the causes that we can discuss on is how the world is moving from a unipolar order to a multipolar order, and how that is influencing the conflicts that we're seeing and how they're unraveling and cascading. So what is leading to this multipolar order, and how is that influencing for to cause so many wars? And what does this mean to, putting it much into a broader scale, to the stability of an entire system based on a unipolar order, which is, the United States?
So the idea, this is really a core question that you're asking here. And there's two parts to it, as you point out. There is both how is it that we're moving into a multipolar order? And of course, we should clarify exactly what do we mean by a multipolar order. And then to the other part of your question, why is it that moving into a multipolar order would create conditions for more conflict, right? And so those are kind of the two elements to it. So first of all, let's talk about the multipolar order. So what we mean in my discipline, international relations, when we use the phrase polar, we're referring to the number of major powers in the world as a pole, right? And so hence you can have a multipolar system where there's multiple major powers. You can have a bipolar system, which is typically how we think of the Cold War era, where the US and the Soviet Union were the two poles. You can have a unipolar system, which is how people thought about, and how indeed, not even thought about, but kind of the reality of the immediate post-Cold War world, right? And this was even referred to as the unipolar moment, where the United States was the sole global power during the 1990s into the 2000s. And what has been happening over, say, the past 10 to 15 years is there's been this gradual change in the international system going from unipolarity, the ending of the unipolar moment, to the emergence of multipolarity. And that is due to the rise of China, which of course is something that many of us talked about. And many pundits have been a lot written on that over the past decade, but also the resurgence of Russia. And even though Russia, of course, economically speaking, is not at the same level of the United States or China, but they have developed enough militarily, economically, to be able to be in a position to influence global events, especially regional events, but events throughout the Eurasian continent and supercontinent, if you will. And so those are two of the key additional poles on the United States. Now, there's a lot of debate about, is the U.S. still the first among equals, right? It might be multipolar. That doesn't mean all the poles are of the same size. You can have a situation where the U.S. could still be the largest economy, could still be the largest military, but these other countries are at a point themselves where they can start to influence global politics. So you can have a multipolar system without all the poles being of equal size. But the reason why this would start to create conditions for more conflict is because of a phrase that's been used quite a bit over the past several years, almost to the point of where people have, roll their eyes when they hear this phrase, and that is great power competition, right? Okay, there's been this, because we now have the emergence of multipolarity, we now have these major powers here, or great powers. Well, what do? They start to compete with each other for influence in their respective regions, compete with each other for influence on the global scale, not just militarily, but economically, diplomatically, etc. And the consequence of that great power competition can be, well, there can be several consequences of it. One of them is that competition itself can lead to conflict, especially if one of the entities that is causing the conflict is one of those great powers. So that would be, of course, the case of Russia with Ukraine. That if Russia is attacking Ukraine, and if part of the dynamics that's leading Russia to attack Ukraine is Ukraine's relationship with the other pole, the United States, that is one of the ways in which great power competition can feed into conflict. But the other way it can feed into conflict is great power competition can lead to great power distraction, right? And that is that if the great powers are competing with each other and focused on each other, then they're not trying to solve all the other issues in the world, right? And so this was one of the things that during the unipolar moment, almost to the point to where, not even almost to the point, it was to the point to where we would make fun of it, which was that the U.S. was the world's police force, right? That was the movie, Team America, World Police, right? But that movie was capturing this idea that the United States was the only country in the world that could go around and try to solve all the other problems that were happening around the world, even to the point of where the U.S. is further creating problems by trying to do that. Might have had good intentions, but is going around creating further issues. But during the unipolar moment, that did seem to be something the U.S. was at least trying to do. There was a phrase, I think it is associated with Hillary Clinton, especially when Clinton became Secretary of State, but it was the idea of be caught trying, right? Just even if you can't fix the problem, at least be caught trying to fix the problem, right? The U.S. needs to try to be involved everywhere, trying to address lower level conflicts, not just the big conflicts. But part of the reason why the U.S. could do that is they didn't have another major power that they needed to be focused on. But as you have this great power competition rising, well, now the U.S. is like, well, we don't need to deal with this issue over there, or we can't deal with this issue over there because we have our resources dedicated towards countering China's ambitions towards Taiwan, or we have our resources dedicated towards trying to stop Russia in Ukraine. So we can't go around and try to address all these smaller issues that then in turn could flare up. And that is another way in which the rise of multipolarity can lead to this issue of growing conflict. And that's in conjunction with the fact that the U.S. itself might be part of the contributor to multipolarity, might be that the U.S. itself is actually declining in power, which means it just simply doesn't have the resources now to go around and address all of these issues. So that's the way in which multipolarity could feed into conditions that create a world at war.
Wow, and so there's so many questions that I've written down. I feel that I need to address a crucial one, which is, given that with the United States being, the hegemon of the world, we would still see conflicts worldwide. We would still see wars or proxies, happening across the world. But like you say, the implication of the United States falling as the hegemon of the world is leading, you could see the graph, power of the United States decreasing, a cascade of wars increasing. So there's like a correlation in a sense, you could argue, like you just mentioned with multipolarity. So, Professor, the first question that comes into mind is multipolarity a synonym of conflict? Will we just see a continuous conflict now that the United States, or rather the world as a whole, is not used to, or is starting to get used to a global order without the United States being the sole leader, or at least the perceived leader? Is that the norm?
I think there's a lot. I really like this question because there's a lot we can unpack with it, right? So first of all, just I think to directly answer your question, I don't think multipolarity is a synonym for conflict, but this gets to the heart of a whole debate that international relations scholars have had for decades, going back into the Cold War, which is that is multipolarity more closely associated with conflict, or is bipolarity more stable? This was a big debate during the Cold War, was which of these systems tends to be more closely associated with conflict? Is it multipolarity? Is it bipolarity? And there were people on either side who argued, oh, well, no, multipolarity, there's more great powers to rectify things, so that should lead to more stability. There were others who said, no, bipolarity, because each of the respective major powers can kind of reel in their subordinates, if you will, their allies that are in their respective blocks. Of course, this is an abstraction of just thinking about the Cold War world, and that should lead to less conflict. So there was a whole debate back and forth about which of these is more stable, let alone then bringing in unipolarity. And there were, of course, I had already laid out the argument of why people viewed the, quote, Pax Americana or the unipolar moment as potentially being one that would bring about stability. But there were others who would point out, well, no, unipolarity can lead to just as much conflict because maybe the unipole doesn't feel constrained, right? And so they feel like they can get involved in all of these conflicts and actually foment conflict. And that would, of course, be used to explain why the U.S. had the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The U.S. felt like it was in a position it could just do that. Who's going to stop them? So there's a whole debate about, which of these polarities is more or less associated with more conflict. My own view is that multipolarity tends to be associated with more conflict. I've always kind of come down on that side, mostly because, first of all, the two world wars were a product of multipolarity. And so I think that's the first thing that we can see. The second reason is that the 19th century itself was actually a time of a lot of conflict, and that was indeed a time of multipolarity. The Cold War, of course, we have to be clear, the Cold War, it's a misnomer that the Cold War was cold. There was a lot of conflict going on around the world. We've never had a year over the past 200 plus years. There's never been a year where there has not been a war happening somewhere in the world. There's always been war. War is always happening somewhere. But there's been times where there's been more of it happening and less of it happening. And we're in one of those times where there's more of it happening, which again, to me, is consistent with this idea of multipolarity contributes to more conflict. So I think that is a big reason why we're seeing this. Now, another potential element of what your question gets at is kind of thinking about this notion of order and thinking about the phrase that it was used, that's been used a lot. And again, is another one of these phrases that's been used a lot to the point of criticism, but that is the idea of the liberal international order, right? And this is, of course, the idea that the U.S., through the unipolar moment, led this international system that's based on international trade, international institutions, rule of law. Of course, that's like another phrase used for it is rules-based order, so on and so forth. And that this would help foster peace. And indeed, that is a comment that's been used by many, many, say, U.S. presidents over the past 8 decades, has been that our liberal international order, or the international order led by the United States, helps to foster peace. Now, of course, there's still a lot of war happening, but it's, there's not the war between major powers like World War II. It's the idea. What we've been witnessing with the rise of multipolarity is a growing assertiveness of certain countries to not want to be part of that order. And indeed, you could view what's happening as part of this transition away from trying to create a single order for the international system, a rules-based order, and potentially the system bifurcating into 2 orders, right? Splitting into one where it's a U.S.-led order, quote, Western order, if you want to call it that, and the other, which is an order of Russia, China, the countries that typically have been associated through what's called BRICS, except with and of course, a couple of those countries who are BRICS countries like India and Brazil are kind of playing both sides. They're like trying to figure out which side do we want to go. And it's very clear, especially in the case of a country like India, where they're like, well, we're not fully on board with Russia and China, but we're also not fully on board with the United States. And indeed, we're going to continue to trade with Russia. And so you can see where there's like this jostling and kind of this beginning to split of the order. That is another contributor to the conflict and can be yet another reason why you would see multipolarity being associated with more conflict.
Wow. And yeah, you just touched on BRICS and how perhaps in a way there's these coalitions coming together, and that also comes into play when we see, I've also seen that you've commented on, what's happening in Yemen, especially with the Houthis, and how there was a coalition of nations, United States, you have Great Britain, you have many nations that decided to come together to prevent that and to stop the shipments, the taking of ships, and of the disruption of the Red Sea and the disruption of, oils, trade, and etc. All of those things. And so the question here is twofold, Professor, is the United States does continue to interfere, or rather intervene in the global scale. Of course, we've seen it with the war in Ukraine. We've seen it with the now recent war in Gaza. And at the same time, we're also seeing the United States falling down in the house of cards, you could say, in the international house of cards. And so the question here is, because personally speaking, of course, I'm biased. I live in the United States, but when I see them intervening, it does imply that we still have the intentions of maintaining stability. But on the other hand, like you say, with the statement of Hillary Clinton saying we need to just show that we're doing something. And so how much of this line between, actually intervening, we saw the airstrikes yesterday, in fact, versus just showing is happening, and how much will the US continue to intervene in these kind of situations? Because now it's a very direct intervention with the airstrikes in Yemen versus selling guns and arms to Ukraine, or supporting the war in Gaza in Israel's perspective. And so I don't know if I'm explaining myself, but these two situations.
So I think I think you're explaining yourself very well. In that, to me, the heart of your question is we're still seeing the U.S. being caught trying, right? We're still seeing the U.S. being involved, and I think that in many ways, a lot of what you just highlighted illustrates exactly the heart of the issue. Meaning, okay, we have the U.S. involved in Ukraine. They are assisting Ukraine. They're arming Ukraine, resources, money, diplomatic support, holding together the coalition of sanctions against Ukraine. These are all things that the Biden administration has been working very hard to do since February of 2022. And of course, the U.S. has been supporting Ukraine even going back further because of Russia's annexation in 2014.
Yeah.
But then you start to layer on top of that other issues, right? There's other crises that start to come up. And of course, most notably is the war in Gaza, which, again, is another one of these conflicts that didn't come out of nowhere. It's not like, oh, wait, why is there a conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, or Israel and Hamas? Like, that's unheard of. It's like, well, no, they've been fighting. They've had conflict for years. This was a conflict that kind of goes through phases in terms of becoming more escalated, less escalated. And indeed, October of 2023 was one of these escalations. Well, now all of a sudden the U.S. is like, okay, well, we've got to address this. So you right away saw where immediately there were constraints. The U.S. had resources dedicated towards Ukraine, and they're like, well, we don't have enough rockets. I mean, literally, we do not have enough munitions to send to both Ukraine and Israel, because they're trying to support both of them. So they divert some of the munitions from Ukraine to Israel. Now, we can debate about whether they should have done that, and there's a whole other side of this. And of course, that's playing out right now, indeed, in the International Court of Justice with South Africa bringing the genocide charges against Israel. But to at least set that aside for now, the main point is just that you saw the U.S. is right away like resource constraint. We can't support both of these to the level that we need to. Then, or at least that we want to. Then on top of that, you now have a knock-on effect or a related conflict, a conflict related to Gaza, which is, of course, the conflict happening in the Red Sea with the Houthis, that they're attacking these ships. Primarily, their claim for attacking the ships is that these are ships that are destined to send arms or supplies to Israel, and we're doing this as an effort to try to stop those because of the war in Gaza, and also as a form of punishment for the West for supporting Israel. And now you see the U.S., along with coalition partners, trying to address that problem, right? And that is one that at least the U.S. is somewhat well positioned to address, because the U.S. Navy is, of course, one of the main entities that's addressing that problem. The Navy is not as involved in the other two conflicts, but it points that, okay, yet again, here's another conflict that now the U.S. has to get involved with. And if you start layering these conflicts on top of each other, and you see this cascading of conflicts, you can start to see where it's like there's too many conflicts in too many places too often. Something has to give. Either U.S. resources have to give, or somehow they have to try to end these conflicts. And that then leads into other concerns, such as, is the U.S. going to put pressure on Ukraine to say, hey, we got too many issues, and it doesn't look like you're going to take back your territory from Russia, so could you maybe negotiate a ceasefire, right? You know, that's kind of the next concern, is if the U.S. is this constrained, then the Biden administration is going to say, you know, is there a way to kind of relieve the pressure, but not do so by abandoning a country, but by saying, can we try to end this conflict? And so that is where, so to me, that's kind of the heart of your question, is that we are indeed seeing the U.S. trying still to address all these problems, but they're running into these constraints.
And one of those constraints is, of course, you know, we're getting very close, the closest we've obviously just because of the loss of time, to an election, a presidential election in the United States. And so the concern here is, at least for me, that the United States trying to solve all of these global conflicts diplomatically, with resources, just like you mentioned, we have here an inner crisis in the United States. And quote-unquote crisis, I say, because a lot of people are putting a lot of attention into this election in particular. And so I'd like to switch into the section of our conversation, Professor, into elections that's happening across the world, but especially now starting with the United States. We've seen the Republican arena candidates just narrowing down into two mainstream candidates. Others are contending, are still trying to contend. And we're also seeing President Biden trying to continue his run and his tenure as president. And so how is this ongoing, you know, global conflict, world at war, influencing the, you know, domestic situation in the United States? And how do you see, you know, this dance between trying to get a hold on the world, but at the same time get a hold on a tenure as a president, or, you know, or re-election, or just a new president coming in? I also saw that you created your bold predictions for the United States elections, which we could address too. But how much of a you know, a chess piece is what's happening across the world in the election, and how much is it hurting or influencing, to put it differently, the upcoming presidential election?
This is really going to be a central question for so many people over the course of this year. The fact that it's a presidential election year in the United States, of course, this is one of many elections taking place around the world this year. For me, I don't think world events are going to have a profound impact on the U.S. election itself. And the reason why is not to say that there won't be something at the margin. You know, you could see where Trump or Nikki Haley could say, well, you know, the world is at war. There's all this crisis, and it wouldn't be that way if I was president, blah, blah, blah. So you could see statements like that. But the main reason why is because at the end of the day, I don't think U.S. voters really vote based on foreign policy world events. That's just not where I see this playing a role, at least in terms of a global scale. Now, one area where you could see it influencing to some extent indirectly is with issues of crime and conflict in South America, Central America, throughout Latin America, and that leading to refugee flows into the United States. And of course, that being a big issue that Donald Trump has politicized for a long time, going back to his Build the Wall campaign, which, again, I always felt was a missed opportunity by Hillary Clinton to say, well, what are you talking about? We already have a wall. I was first lady when we started building the wall. Like, she could have totally just taken that away from Trump. But it points to the idea that the U.S. has long had this issue with its concerns about its southern border having, whether it's a wall or a fence, but definitely being that this is an issue that Donald Trump has politicized. So in that respect, you could see that as a way in which foreign policy could influence the election. But by and large, I think the U.S. public doesn't really vote according to that issue. It's much more about domestic issues, the economy, social policies. These are the things I think mostly drive elections. You think about conservative judges. I want to have certain judges on the Supreme Court. That's why I'm voting for Trump. So that I think is the first thing I want to put out there, is that I don't think world events or this cascade of wars is going to have a huge impact on the U.S. election. But I think the flip side is absolutely the case, which is that the U.S. election will have an immense role in influencing the world events. I think the flip side is absolutely the case. Let's start with Ukraine. I have been saying for a while now that Putin, this is his big play, is he knows he can't push out Ukrainian forces. His military is not poised to be able to reclaim or try to reclaim territory that they had initially gained control of back in February, March, April of 2022. But that's not his objective. His objective is, he thinks, this has been my argument, he thinks he can hold out for a Republican to get into office, ideally Trump, not Nikki Haley, but ideally a Trump getting into office, who would want to try to end the conflict, right? And then that would allow him to be able to consolidate the gains. That would be an immediate direct way in which the U.S. presidential election, if a Donald Trump will be elected, could play into it. Now, of course, this is all based on the idea that Putin would be correct in that estimation. I think there's some uncertainty about that, because Trump is let's assume Trump were to be reelected. I'm not totally sold on the idea that Trump would just immediately turn and say, okay, we got to end support to Ukraine, because he has this thing where he very much has a big ego. He likes it when people play to that ego. And I could see people saying, Donald, the reason why this conflict's going on is because only you know Putin. Only you can stand up to Putin. Biden couldn't really get it done. You could get it done. You know how to stand up to Putin. And I could see that playing to his being like, yeah, I know how to stand up to Putin. We're going to do this. I'm not saying I think that's a lower probability outcome, but I could see that potentially playing out. But regardless, even if that did play out, it would still be a case of where the election would play a role in influencing that conflict. So that's one example of this. I mean, the other way in which it would play a role is if Donald Trump were to be elected, would he then want to kind of scale back U.S. commitments elsewhere? And that's something that was a big point of debate during the previous Trump administration. The previous term was the U.S. scaling back its commitments. Could that happen? Would that lead China to think that it has an opening vis-a-vis Taiwan? Again, I think there's a potential to where Trump would, because he is someone who his trade war with China, I think, you could play it to where Trump would actually say, no, we got to try to counter China. And I think even some potential individuals who would be part of a Trump administration would be absolute China hawks. And so I don't think that would necessarily play a role. But the potential is still there, and that's another way in which we could see that the U.S. presidential election, how it turns out, could absolutely shape these things. Now, of course, all my examples are dealing with Trump. In many ways, it's interesting because Nikki Haley, who at the moment at least seems like the most if there was a candidate in the Republican Party who could gain the nomination instead of Trump, right now it seems like it would be Nikki Haley. If Haley were to get the nomination, if you base it on a lot of the statements she's been making, she doesn't sound all that different from Biden. She doesn't sound that different from a lot of, so I think she would continue to support Ukraine. I don't think there would be much of a change in U.S. policy if Nikki Haley were to become president. But if Trump were to become president, then it's a little bit more of a wild card. Actually, it's a lot more of a wild card because there's this great concern that he would actually dial back U.S. commitments. But again, I still think that for, depending on who it is, because this, like, say, for example, during the previous administration, Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, played this masterful. He was masterful in terms of doing this, of like playing to Trump's ego and being like, oh yeah, this is why NATO spending's increasing. It's all because of Trump. Of course, it wasn't because of Trump. The allies had already committed to doing this, but he really played to that. And that made Trump say, yeah, this is because of me and everything. So I think that there's a potential that could still happen, but it is a huge wild card. And for that reason, that's why the U.S. presidential election matters for all of these conflicts.
They do. The elections will play a pivotal role, as you clearly point out, and I appreciate it. And these scenarios, one of the bold predictions you had is, of course, Trump gets in every ballot, but the other one is Biden gets reelected. And so the question here is, of course, we covered how a Republican ticket would influence world events, but how do you think a continued 4-year administration of Biden could influence what we're seeing with Gaza, what we're seeing with Ukraine? Of course, the support is there, but how do you see the landing, or at least the attempt of landing this conflict into a peaceful resolution? Or, 4 years could happen, a lot of things could happen. Maybe I'm just being hopeful that they could lead to peace in any administration. Trump said that peace would be through strength in his town hall. But with Biden, how do you see the world events playing out?
So I think that this is important for us to talk about because my view is that this is the most likely scenario, is that Biden is reelected. I hold that view for a few reasons. First of all, just one of the things we know about presidential elections is an incumbency advantage. The incumbent almost always has the advantage. The incumbent always has an advantage. Whether or not they are able to take advantage of that advantage is another issue, obviously, because Trump was not reelected. But the incumbent always comes in with an advantage. But the other part of it is that Trump is, for everything we've talked about, I've long said that I actually don't think Trump is that great of a president. He's not that great of a candidate. He basically, 2016, he won, but he barely won under conditions in which he should have won by a landslide. And he barely won. So that kind of showed, that showed, first of all, one thing about the weakness of Trump. I mean, the reality is in 2016, the Republican candidate, because of the fact that you're coming off of a 2-term Democratic president, right away, that's a huge advantage to whoever's going to get the Republican nomination. Trump got it, but he barely won. He kind of won on a technicality. And that already pointed to me to the weakness of Trump as a candidate. Then, of course, 2018, there was the blue wave. 2020 election, he lost, and indeed, they lost control of both houses. And then 2022, there was this expectation of a red wave, and Trump's going to help to create support, and that didn't pan out. So I actually don't think Trump's all that great of a candidate anyhow. And then when you layer on top of it all of these lawsuits he's facing, Chris Christie, of course, has made this argument during the Republican primary of like, how in the world is someone who's dealing with all this stuff going to actually win the presidency? So these are the reasons. These are the huge headwinds that go against Trump winning the nomination. That's not to say he's not going to win any votes, or not win the nomination, but win the presidency. So I do think that the most likely outcome is Biden being reelected. Now, of course, there's big concerns about if Biden's reelected, how will his health be? He's he's in his 80s. This is going to be this is a concern of, would he actually be able to complete his second term? And that is going to be a big concern. And then how would that actually influence things if he's not able to complete that term? If Harris continues as the vice president, what kind of policy preferences would she want to implement? Would she just follow the same line as the Biden administration? Would she try to bring in her own views on this, her own preferences with this, and to what extent do those preferences differ from Biden? Those are the open questions. But obviously, if Biden wins re-election, I think someone like a President Zelensky of Ukraine is going to have a big sigh of relief, because it eliminates that uncertainty that I was talking about with a Trump. But the question would be how much could that be maintained? What will happen over the course of a 4-year Biden administration? To what extent would Biden himself still be in a position to actually be able to put forward, U.S. leadership on all of these issues? That's going to be a huge question. And that could be something that in turn works against him in the general election. But the only reason it wouldn't is Trump himself is quite a bit older, right? This is a whole other issue of the fact, and many people are pointing this out, that the U.S. presidential election could come down to two people who are either 80 or pushing 80. And it's what does that mean regardless of who wins the election? Trump is not in the best health in the world, right? What could happen if he's president, and would he even be able to be in a condition to complete a second term from a health standpoint? These are big issues, big questions we have. But with Biden, I think at first there would be a sigh of relief for respect to supporting these conflicts, but there would be another form of uncertainty, which is, well, is Biden going to be there for 4 years to be able to continue to pursue U.S. policy the way he wants to pursue it?
And Professor, you don't see any scenario in which Biden decides, throughout the campaign trail or close to the election, or, in any given moment before the election, saying, I need to step down. I don't want re-election? Or do you see just maybe the continuation of Biden's election, just waiting until perhaps, let's just put a scenario, first year of his presidency says, it is, I don't know if it's even possible, constitutionally speaking, but if he would be to step down, do you see him stepping down before the election? Or, maybe just playing it out until he wins?
I don't see him stepping down before the election, barring some sort of health crisis, right? I think if there was some sort of, health crisis with him, then I could see that might happen. But short of that, I don't see that happening. Now, your other question about would he step down after the election, right? Is it possible that Biden has in his mind, his main role is to beat Trump? And if he can beat Trump again, then he is more than happy to step aside and say if it is Kamala Harris to be the vice president still, then, allow Harris to take over, right? That's possible. I also don't know if that would play out, at least in the way, it's kind of described here, where he just says, hey, I have to step down. I could see that either of these scenarios would happen because of some sort of health concern, which of course, given his age, could indeed happen. So that's why that is really the main thing to be looking at. But I don't foresee, short of that, I don't foresee him saying, you know what, I hear you all, you're not happy about having someone who's in his 80s running for president, I'm going to step aside. At this point, I don't see that happening, especially given that, the primary season has started. That's not going to play out.
Wow. For my last question regarding the elections in the United States, Professor, is I did a poll on my YouTube channel where 3,700 people answered, and the question was, what is going to be the biggest challenge in 2024? And 68%, Professor, said political polarization and social unrest. And that's a huge number, at least from the other polls, which have seen a even distribution of answers. 68% said that they're concerned about political polarization. And so I think, also personally speaking, it does seem that it's going to be, again, 2020 was a very contentious election. We know the history, but or at least on my perspective, I'd love to hear your insights into it. Regardless of the outcome on 2024, there's going to be some sort of social response. People are, there's been a lot of discussion about civil war. There's been movies that are, going to be released saying civil war, like, people getting programmed into it. But the idea here is, should we expect a peaceful transfer of power? Should we expect an election that is normal, that is, really the cusp of democracy, a normal process? Or do you see somehow, again, 2024 becoming a social polarization moment for the United States?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say because it really depends on a few factors. The first factor it depends on is just things continue to play out the way that I think people might expect it to play out. Meaning, okay, everybody's going back to what we were just talking about. Everybody's in good health, and the election happens between Biden and Trump. That's kind of the first thing we're expecting, right? So we have to assume that first, because obviously, if that changes, then everything's kind of off. Secondly, that the election itself happens, and for me, I think what's going to be very key is if Biden wins, how clearly and quickly is that evident? Because a big contributor to the issues in 2020, and it's something I don't feel like gets enough attention, is the fact that 2020 took place during the height of COVID. And as a result, you had a lot of absentee ballots that were issued. I voted absentee at that time. And what that led to was this delay in counting all the ballots. And that is something that then in turn created a lot of animosity, or and even opportunities for people to start saying, hey, what's going on here? Where are all these ballots coming in? Where got this? Well, it's like, well, these are the absentee ballots coming in, right? This is a normal process. So I think that if you're in a situation come this fall where most people are going in, voting at the polls, and we have a scenario where, I can remember many presidential elections where the outcome was pretty much announced that evening, right? They could identify, yep, so-and-so is going to win, and it's already cleared. We've made the calls. If that happens, then it's really hard for Trump's claims of fraud, which will happen. He will claim those. I think he will. It's going to be hard for those to gain traction. They're going to gain traction with somebody. They're going to gain traction with some people, but I don't see them gaining the traction to the point of leading to another January 6th. Obviously, he's not going to be the incumbent. So that's going to be one thing that's going to change from a January 6th. But the other thing is even being able to create some sort of riot in that way. The other reason, you wouldn't see that is, of course, January 6th happened. So there's going to be steps taken to not allow another January 6th to happen, right? So those are, to me, I think those are kind of key things, is that number one, things kind of go in the direction we expect them to go. But number two, if Biden wins fairly convincingly and early in this election, then it's just much harder for these kind of claims that could trigger that polarization to lead to political violence. It's going to be much harder for those to be sustained. That's my view of the situation.
Interesting. We'll have to have a special episode just on the election, because there's, so many questions on this front. But Professor, you also have discussed that 2024 is going to be a year where pretty much the whole definition of election is going to be tested. We're going to see more than, I think, 60 elections worldwide, which constitute around 40% of the global GDP, which is, I think, around, 2.5 or 3 billion people in elections. Some of them you've discussed in your articles that some of them may be symbolic. For example, what will happen, of course, in Russia? Will it be a symbolic election, or the one that was, in those blurry lines, as you write, is Zelensky's election, during a war. How will a Ukraine election influence the whole world? But, at the time of recording, tomorrow, there's going to be one, I think it's going to be and of course, you're going to provide us more insights, but the Taiwan election on January 13th is going to be, at the time of the publishing of this episode, we're going to see the results. But it's going to be a watershed moment, at least as the year begins with the election. And so talk to me about, your predictions about the Taiwan election. Of course, this is going to be a weird, answer post the election. But how do you see these elections playing out, and how will they influence, or at least what are some of the surprises, or rather lack thereof, in terms of a situation where, Xi Jinping has said that annexation is imminent, or, other candidates not supporting it, the whole public not supporting, citizens of Taiwan not supporting the annexation. And so talk to me about Taiwan, Professor.
I think the main thing that I would say about Taiwan, and, there's definitely people who can speak more in depth on the nature of the candidates and what to expect from the election. But I think the perspective that I want to take on this is indeed on that broader point that you just pointed to, which is that what could Taiwan's election imply for relations between Taiwan and People's Republic of China, and how would China react to it? And there's a few ways to think about this. One is, I don't think much of anything will change. I think that, there'll be an election, there'll be some statements made by Xi or what have you, but basically the status quo situation is going to continue, right? I don't think there's going to be, because of the election outcome, there's going to be suddenly a great declaration of independence by Taiwan or assertion of it. I don't think U.S. policy towards Taiwan is going to suddenly change to where they make it explicit that they recognize Taiwan as an independent sovereign nation. Of course, U.S. policy is to be very ambiguous on that front. So I think Taiwan's election is important from the standpoint of two things. Number one, it's the first big election of a year of elections, right? And that's what I was talking about, is that this is the start of really a record year. It's an interesting contrast to 2023, where 2023 was this record year of conflict. 2024 is this record year of elections. So it's important from that standpoint. That's the first reason why it's important. But the second reason why it's important is because of the broader point that I was raising when I wrote about this in the piece, which is that Taiwan's election serves as a contrast to what's happening in People's Republic of China. This is why annexation is not something that's on the table, because what we've seen, of course, over the past several years in the People's Republic of China is we've seen this consolidation of power around President Xi, and to the point to where China could have plausibly made an argument, say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that they had some, quote, democratic features. What do I mean by that? They could have made the argument that, yes, we don't have a democracy like the United States. We don't have a democracy with a parliament and so forth. But the leader is chosen through an election amongst the leaders of the Communist Party. And so in that sense, there's some limited democratic trappings that are happening, or you can go into any time that a leader's chosen out of a group of 200. But that has been, even that limited amount of a nugget of democracy there has been constrained with the reforms that Xi has made over the past decade plus. And so that stands very much in contrast to then Taiwan, of course, having these elections, kicking off the year with these elections. And I think in that sense, that's why this is such an important election from that standpoint. But I don't think the election itself is going to change any dynamics on the ground. I don't think it's going to lead to a sudden change, even though Xi has made things about, inevitably we will try to invade Taiwan. I think that's going to happen on China's own time, on Xi's own timeline, regardless of this election. And moreover, I don't think this election outcome is going to suddenly lead to some sort of dramatic shift in Taiwan's policy of like, okay, now we are assertively declaring ourselves independent from People's Republic of China, given that that is absolutely not what the U.S. wants or any of the other backers wants. But I think so that's the way that I would think about the outcome of the election. Now, of course, as you said, this is happening. We're recording this the day before these elections happen. So by the time this comes out, there could be, some interesting surprises that happen. But my prior going into it is that there won't be nothing out of this election will point to any major changes in the status quo in that region.
Let's hope that, in the cascade of wars that we're witnessing, Taiwan conflict is an unlikely scenario, because that would also add into the United States issues that we just discussed in this conversation. So, Professor, Taiwan election is going to be, it's going to begin the whole election year, record year, but there's a couple more that are going to happen. I discussed Ukraine, but I think one of the other elections that could really influence international relations, or, at least make a dent into them, are the elections in India. How President Modi is going to be challenged, or what's going to happen there. And so what are your thoughts into the elections happening in India, and how would that influence, of course, the whole global conflict?
So it's interesting that I guess these are going to be boring predictions for your listeners, but it's kind of similar to the Taiwan one in that I'm not expecting this election to lead to much of a change. Now, in this case here, it's because I think Modi's going to win. I think that he's using this as a way to further consolidate, political power that he has. And so in that sense, I could see India continuing to follow along the lines of where they've been going, which is a growing, not independence, but definitely, I would say, a growing assertiveness. We touched on it earlier in our conversation of where India is a country that is straddling the line between the two orders or emerging orders. They are a country that both trying to have relations with the United States, but also having relations with Russia and China. It's a member of the quote Quad, which is with Japan, the United States. But it is a country that is a member of BRICS. And so it's like, how do you deal with, and so to me, that is very much a manifestation of not just Modi specifically, though I do think it's something that plays very well to his strength. He is known as a Hindu nationalist, and this means kind of asserting India's view, India as a country, nationalism being, India is not subservient to the United States, but they're also not subservient to China. They can carve out, to use a phrase that was often used to even describe European policy during the Cold War, a third way, right? We don't have to be between these two poles. We can have our own policy on it. So I think that in that sense, the election is important to watch just because it is such an important democracy in the world. But I actually don't think it's going to lead to any type of outcome that would dramatically change international relations.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting election, like you say, and I think they're very much associated, at least with me, with what will happen in Ukraine. At least, perhaps they're going to be symbolic as well. We don't know. But what are on your perspective, what other elections are you keeping a close eye on as the year starts? What are some of the elections that are on top of mind for you?
Well, I think for me, one election that could be quite interesting is there's it's funny, there's 60 elections happening in the world, but there's the three that I'm most interested in are three that may not even happen this year. So that's the three I'm wondering about. One of them is an election that could happen in the UK. Obviously, the UK has had a rather tumultuous few years in terms of the politics and cycling through foreign ministers, cycling through prime ministers. And that is something. UK is slated to have elections, but those could go into 2025. Technically, those could go into 2025. But depending on how that goes, you could see, if it goes conservative, if it goes Labor, that could play a very important role in a number of ways. Could it play a role in shaping how the UK continues to support Ukraine? They've been a key supporter of Ukraine. Could it play a role in how the UK maybe even considers revising its stance vis-a-vis Brexit, right? That is why that's an important election to really pay attention to. Because to me, I think in turmoil that we've witnessed over the past few years domestically is not unrelated to the very things that led to Brexit, but also a consequence of Brexit, the kind of the economic disruptions that have been caused by Brexit and so on and so forth. So I think that's an election that I want to keep an eye on, that I could see absolutely playing a big role. But again, what's interesting is it may not actually happen this year. It could happen because they can call it. They have to call it by, I think, the end of January 2025. So it's likely it can happen this year, but it may not. The other two, and I've highlighted this, is Israel. This would be huge. Now, Israel does not have to have an election this year, but the support that Netanyahu has within his coalitional government is very tenuous. And there is a chance that his government could collapse. I think they're even pointing out that this is part of the reason why Israel's been pursuing the policies they've been pursuing. Is Netanyahu himself is a hawk, but he's also reliant on a coalitional partners who themselves are very, very hawkish towards the Palestinians, towards Gaza. And as a result, this is kind of informing why Israel's having to pursue this policy towards Gaza, this military campaign towards Gaza, to the degree that they've been pursuing it. It's not a question of should Israel have responded to the attacks against Hamas. It's a question of the level at which they're responding to these attacks. And that's a whole other issue for him of why his government could collapse. Is a big reason why a big part of his legitimacy most recently as prime minister is, I will keep you safe. Well, that failed on October 7th, and it failed in part due to their own policies. And so as a result, they've doubled down and overreacted, in my view, with how they're carrying out operations in Gaza. But this could have an impact to where his government could collapse. And if his government collapses and there's elections there, then, a lot of things could change. And given how the war in Gaza has been influencing not just itself, but also these other conflicts we mentioned about in the Red Sea with the Houthis, that could have huge implications if that were to take place. And then the final one is, I mentioned Ukraine. You brought up Ukraine as well. Now, Ukraine was supposed to have an election this year. They're at least presently not going to have an election this year. They're obviously in the middle of war, and it can be hard to have an election when you're in the middle of a war, and you're having the kind of bombing that's occurring. But I've made the argument recently that they should try to have an election this year. Now, I should add that I came under some criticism for making that argument. People saying, no, it's impossible. Ukraine cannot have an election while this is occurring. I understand those arguments. Their support is based, a large part of their support is based on the fact that they embody democratic ideals. That has been even the language that has been used by a lot of countries in the West to support Ukraine. And so as a result, it's important that Ukraine still tries to embody those ideals, because that's a key part of their support. Now, some people would say, well, that's not fair to Ukraine. Other countries maybe could get away with not having elections. But the problem is you have key individuals who could decide the kind of external support that Ukraine receives, who are making that argument. They're making the argument that if Ukraine isn't holding elections, then we don't know why we're supporting them, because they're not supporting the democratic ideals that at least they espouse to. So it might be an unfair situation for Ukraine, but this is one reason why trying to hold the elections is important. The other reason is I understand when people say, well, Ukraine can't hold an election this year because it can't logistically happen due to the fighting and so forth. But I'll just say maybe I'm naive in this, but I don't fully buy that argument. And the reason why is twofold. Number one, there have been a lot of things since February 2022 that people said Ukraine can't do, and they've done, right? There has been a lot of things. I mean, even having the trains running on time. They've been able to keep trains running on time. There's been a lot of public works and social services, functioning of society that Ukrainians have been able to do that other people said, oh, no, they can't do that because of Russian invasion. They can't do this because of that. They've been able to do it. The other one is that, the analogy some people will point to is the fact that, like, the British didn't hold elections during, big parts of World War II because they were under bombing. But we're in a very different environment than during World War II. We're in an environment where we do have absentee balloting. We have mail-in ballot voting. We have electronic voting. And yes, there are some logistical issues with those. But given what I was just saying, I feel like there's ways to be able to address those issues. They might lead to a delay of the election because you have to try to sort those things out. But I feel like Ukraine, those are the reasons why I think it would be important for Ukraine to try to hold its elections as soon as possible. And I mentioned this year. And again, I can understand where people would say that's not fair to the Ukrainians. That's not fair to Zelensky because, other countries are able to do this. But again, Ukraine is in this situation where the foundation of the external support they're receiving is this notion of adherence to democratic ideals. And so it's important for that reason that Ukraine does what it can to try to demonstrate those ideals to help counter those arguments against them.
Wow, those three elections, or possibility of those three elections, are going to be really interesting to see how it unfolds. It's also interesting to see how would the U.S. react to an election in Ukraine. They're supporting Zelensky, so would they support another candidate? That's an interesting topic, I think, for another conversation, Professor. As we begin to wrap up, it's been, a great conversation. A lot of topics we will discuss in future ones. But Professor, one of the ideas that you discussed, or rather shared on Twitter or X, is how we're trying to uphold free expression in a world at war, and how you added that to your syllabus. And like I said, one of the most surprising polls I've ever done in my community is 68% of people believe we're in a political polarized world and of social unrest. And so my last question for you is, how do we uphold free expression in a world at war? How can we maintain, cool-headedness in such an emotional and chaotic and uncertain reality that we're on?
This is such a foundational question to not just what I do as a professor, but again, kind of going back to this notions of the ideals of a free and open society, democratic society. This really goes to the heart of those things. By the way, I still call it Twitter. So, it's okay if you call it Twitter instead of X. I still refer to it as Twitter, or formerly known as Twitter. For me, I really think this is the way I would answer this is the following. So let's say that I was at that congressional hearing where Stefanik asked that question about, are statements of calling for the genocide of Jews, is that something that is a violation of university speech code? I would have given the following answer. I would have said, yes, it is. The reason why is not because the university wants to shut down debate. It is indeed acceptable to have a debate about policies regarding, say, what was really the overall subtext of the question, which was the war in Israel, Israel's policies. It's even okay to have debates about the existence of Israel. Should Israel exist as a country where it is, and so on and so forth. There are ways in which one can have debates about that, but those debates have to be conducted in a way that is respectful, because if it's not done in a respectful fashion, then you can't actually have the deliberation needed to develop understanding. And when you have someone standing up calling for the genocide of a group that is also on your campus, well, that creates direct threats to that group that can shut down the very kind of conversations that you're trying to have. So that would be, to me, what's really key is it's not that an issue is off the table. It's that can we have conversations about the issue that's done in a respectful fashion? And by respectful meaning, it might be uncomfortable. Respectful doesn't mean it has to be comfortable. You can have uncomfortable conversations, but uncomfortable also doesn't mean dangerous. It also doesn't mean that it's a situation where someone's unsafe. And by unsafe meaning physically not safe. And having someone calling for the genocide of a group is creating conditions in which someone can be literally physically unsafe. So that would have been the way in which I would have answered that question. The other thing I would have said about that, and this is part of going to, it's been brought up a lot. I'm at the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago has, of course, the Calvin principles, or Clavin principles, which are the ideas that the university is a home of critics. It is not itself a critic. The idea that the university is a forum in which people can express ideas, and the university might have to, going back to what I just said, may have to step in at times to regulate that, to ensure that the speech is being conducted in a way that supports the principles of the university. But it should not itself be involved in issuing those statements and so forth. It needs to create an environment in which people can have these kind of conversations. To me, something that made a very lasting impression on me when it came to free speech and open speech is years ago, I lived in London, and one of my favorite things to do in London was on Sundays, I would walk down to Speaker's Corner, and I would just see the speakers there, and I just thought it was fascinating. I would do this almost every Sunday. I would just go there and just listen, and you had all sorts of people there arguing all sorts of stuff. And I mean, some of it was just crazy, and you'd see arguments back and forth, but I thought, this is great. And to me, the university is that corner. The university is that corner where, hey, you know what? You can have a discussion, but let's have the discussion in a way that we can actually debate this, right? That's the key. And what differentiates the university from that corner is just an open space. University does have a responsibility to its students, its staff, its faculty who work there to ensure that they're in an environment where they can actually carry out this debate, inquiry, and so forth. That's the one thing that differentiates the university from that form. But overall, this notion that the university is a home for those critics, it is a home for those people to put those soapboxes up and start talking. It is not itself going to actually put up a soapbox and start talking. I think that's so critical to thinking about how we can have open discussion and debate in today's world.
Yeah, and like you say, in your syllabus, you say, let's think this through. Let's think this through. I think that's a good mantra for at least, us who are trying to critically think or trying to embody those values. And it's funny that you mentioned the Speaker's Corner. I went once on my birthday, and I must admit the day before I went on a party, so I was kind of hungover, and the ideas just hit harder. They were like, oh, maybe they're right. And so, but Professor, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for that answer that you just given me. It does give me a lot to think of myself because I'm invested emotionally in some of those conflicts. And, it's kind of hard to distinguish between those, but I'm trying my best to do that. And, I hope that you're being a professor of international relations, you're going to have a lot of debates, hopefully in a good fashion in your classroom. And so I wish you best of luck with that as well.
Thank you.
And Professor, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. And I hope to have you soon again in the show.
Well, thank you so much, Alex, for having me on the show. It's a great conversation. We hit a lot of things, a lot of points, and hopefully this is of value to your listeners. Thank you again.
Thank you, Professor.